On the distant, dying planet of Zorathene, the alien survivors were running out of time. The planet, once lush and full of life, had become a barren wasteland. The once thriving cities were now ruined, and the air was thick with smoke from the nearby battles. The alien forces, outnumbered and outgunned, were on the brink of extinction. The survivors knew that they were being hunted, and no one was coming to save them. But they had one last hope. The survivors, desperate and tired, gathered in a small underground bunker. The leader, a seasoned soldier named Etzera, paced nervously. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, filled with her fellow survivors. They were a mix of soldiers, scientists, and civilians, all thrown together in this hopeless situation. "We've done all we can," Etzera said, her voice steady, but with a trace of worry. "But we're too few. Our weapons are running low. Our supplies are almost gone. We need help." The survivors looked at each other in silence. Their enemies, the powerful Zalnor, were closing in. It sent waves of attacks, and each one had taken a toll on the survivors. Their communication systems were nearly destroyed, and their own people couldn't get to them. The galaxy's most powerful fleets were too far away to help, and no one cared about a small planet like Zorathash9.az. Hurrah turned to the device sitting on the table in front of her, a small, battered communication unit that had somehow survived. The attacks wasn't much, but it was their only link to the outside world. Her fingers hovered over the buttons. She had been told that humanity, a relatively young species on Earth, had a communication network that stretched out into space. Maybe, just maybe, they could help. She glanced around the room at her people. Their faces were tired, filled with fear and uncertainty, but they still clung to the hope that someone would come to their rescue. With a deep breath, Etzera activated the device. A small, blinking light appeared on the screen, signaling that the message was being sent. "Humanity, if you can hear us, we are in dire need of help. We are stranded on Zorathene, under attack by the Zalnor. Our forces are outmatched, and our chances of survival are growing slimmer by the hour. We need your help. Please, we beg you, send assistance." The message was simple, but Azara's heart pounded as she watched the light flicker, indicating that the message had been transmitted. There was nothing more they could do. They had done everything in their power, and now all they could do was wait. The room was eerily quiet as the survivors stood still, eyes fixed on the communication device. They waited for a reply. Minutes turned to hours. Etzera sat down on the cold floor, her eyes never leaving the screen. She couldn't afford to show weakness, but the worry was starting to show in her eyes. "How much longer?" one of the soldiers asked, her voice shaking. "Will be too late." Etzera didn't respond. She couldn't give them false hope. The Zalnor had been relentless, and they were getting closer with each passing minute. She had heard the stories about humanity, about how they were considered primitive by the galactic powers, how they were laughed at for their lack of advanced technology. But Etzera wasn't so sure. She had seen humanity's resilience in action. She knew they could surprise anyone who underestimated them. Still, she had no idea if help would ever come. She sat back, running her fingers through her hair, trying to calm herself. The alien forces had never been known for mercy. If the Zalnor found them first, it would be over. Suddenly, the blinking light on the communication device stopped. Ozara's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, her eyes wide, as a new message appeared on the screen. But it wasn't from humanity. The message was from the Zalnor. Their threat was clear. "We will find you. Your resistance is futile," Etzera cursed under her breath. Slamming her fist against the table, the room was filled with a collective gasp of fear. It was a message that could only mean one thing: the Zalnor were closing in on them faster than they had realized. The survivors were shaken. But Azara knew they couldn't give up. They couldn't surrender to fear. She turned to her people, determination flashing in her eyes. "We will not go down without a fight," Etzera said, her voice firm. "We've faced worse odds before. We will fight to the end." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. The Zalnor were getting closer, and they were running out of time. She turned back to the device, silently pleading for any sign of humanity's response. But the device remained silent. They had been left on read. Hours passed. The sound of distant explosions echoed in the background as the Zalnar forces drew nearer. Zara's nerves were frayed, but she refused to let them break. She had to keep fighting, for her people, for their survival. Then, just as the light from the device began to fade, a new message came through. The screen flashed. "We are coming. Hold on. Help is on the way." The words were simple. They were brief. But they gave the survivors something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Atsara stared at the message in disbelief. They there? Coming, her people gathered around, reading the message over and over again. It wasn't much, but it was all they needed to hear. The humans had heard their call. Hope wasn't dead. Not yet. Atsara sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the communication device. Her heart raced as she waited for any sign that humanity had heard their call. She read the message over and over again. "We are coming. Hold on. Help is on the way." Mind couldn't quite grasp it. After all the silence, all the doubt, the humans had answered. But she wasn't sure what to expect. A ship? A fleet? What kind of help could they offer with such limited resources? The odds were against them. The Zalnar were strong, relentless, and close. She glanced around the room at the other survivors. Some looked hopeful, others still seemed uncertain, as if they couldn't believe it could be true. They had been let down before. How could they trust a species they knew so little about? "Is this real?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice shaking. His hands were gripping his rifle tightly, as if expecting danger to break through the walls at any moment. "I don't know," Atsara replied, trying to steady her voice. "But we have no choice but to believe it." But the uncertainty hung. In the air, everyone in the room felt it. They were barely holding on. The Zalnar had already started to search the surrounding areas. Their ships could be seen in the sky, prowling like hungry predators. Soon the survivors knew they would be hunted down one by one, unless something drastic happened. Hours passed. The device remained silent, offering no further communication. From humanity, Azara's heart sank with every passing minute. Were the humans really coming? Had they been left on red again? Were they too late? She couldn't bear the thought of it. The survivors had fought so hard to hold on, but the fight was slipping away. If humanity didn't show up soon, they would be finished. The Zalnar won't stop, said Joran, one of the survivors. He was a scientist, and though his field wasn't combat, he had a sharp mind. They'll find us, they'll destroy us all. Atsara turned toward him, her voice steady. Not if we can. Help it. We'll fight. We'll hold them off for as long as we can. But even as she spoke, the doubt crept in. Their weapons were almost gone. Their defenses had already been shattered. They didn't stand a chance against the Zalnar's full force. All they had now was hope, and that hope was slipping away. The survivors huddled together, gathering what little they had left to prepare for battle. Atsara reviewed the plan one more time, but it was clear that they didn't have enough resources to withstand an attack. They could hold out for a while, but it wasn't enough. They would be overrun, and it would be over then. Just as despair threatened to take over, the communication device flickered back to life. Atsara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at the screen. The message was there. It was from humanity. The message read, "We're almost there. Hold tight." Azara's heart skipped a beat. They were coming. It was real. The humans were on their way. She looked around at the other survivors, who were now gathering closer. They read the message together, and for the first time in hours, there was a spark of hope in their eyes. The feeling spread like wildfire through the group, and for a moment, they all allowed themselves to believe that help was truly on the way. But even so, the worry didn't leave Azara's mind. Could humanity really save them? How long would it take for the human ship to arrive? And what would it take to stop the Zalnar from attacking before they did? She turned to one of the soldiers, Tarek. "You and Joran, take up position on the north side. We'll need to slow the Zalnar down. As much as possible. Don't let them get too close. The rest of us will stay here and defend the entrance. If the humans are really coming, we need to keep fighting." Tarek nodded, his face grim. "Understood." As they split up, Atsara couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Fear, hope, uncertainty. It was all swirling inside her. She knew. They didn't have much time. Zalnar would be on them soon, and they had to make every second count. The survivors took their positions, preparing for the fight of their lives. The sky overhead was darkening, the sound of distant explosions echoing in the distance as the Zalnar made their way toward the planet. Azara's fingers tightened around her weapon as she stared into the horizon, watching for any sign of the human ship. The silence was deafening. It felt like the calm before the storm, and it made her uneasy. Had the humans truly heard their call, or was it just another false hope? The minutes felt like hours. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the air grew thick. Then, suddenly, a distant roar broke the silence. A bright light appeared in the sky, too bright, too powerful to be anything ordinary. It grew larger with each passing second, and Azara's heart raced as she realized what it was. The human ship had arrived. The Zalnar forces, still a distance away, had seen the ship as well. They began to adjust their formations, preparing to face the unexpected arrival. But Atsara knew one thing for sure. Now this wasn't just any ship. This was humanity's answer. This was their salvation. The survivors gathered in a small group, watching the human ship in awe as it hovered in the distance. It was smaller than the Zalnar ships, but there was something undeniably fierce about it. Azara's hope grew stronger. Humanity was here, and they had come just in time. The human ship was unlike anything the survivors had seen before. Its sleek, silver frame glinted in the dim light of the setting sun. It was small compared to the massive Zalnar warships, but it had an undeniable presence. It was moving fast, and as it approached, the survivors couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Azara's heart raced. She had seen countless ships in her lifetime, some of them massive, some of them terrifying, but this human ship was different. It looked outdated, almost primitive compared to the ships of the Zalnar and other galactic empires. Yet it was coming toward them with a speed that made her wonder if appearances were deceiving. "That's them, right?" Tarek asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "It has to be," Atsara said, barely able to contain the excitement and fear that surged inside her. "That's the ship they sent." The survivors gathered around the communication device, now fully charged, hoping to get more information from the humans. The message they had received earlier had been brief. "We're almost there. Hold tight." But it had been enough to spark the fire of hope in their hearts. Now, with the ship growing larger in the sky, Atsara could feel her breath catching. In her throat, the Zalnar forces were still miles away, but they were closing in quickly. The survivors knew they had very little time. They had to make the most of this moment. Atsara turned to her team, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to prepare. The Zalnar could attack any minute. Get into position. We need to buy time for..." The humans, the team scattered quickly. Atsara and her soldiers took their posts, keeping their eyes trained on the horizon. The human ship was still coming in fast, its bright light cutting through the darkness. Despite its small size, it was a sight to behold. The survivors had been prepared to fight until the end, but now they had something they hadn't dared to expect an ally. As the ship drew closer, Atsara could see that it wasn't just one ship. There were smaller vessels dropping from it, like stars falling from the sky. They were fast, moving with precision, and she knew immediately they were part of the human war effort. These ships weren't just for show, they were here to fight. She turned to Tarek. "Stay focused. The Zalnar aren't going to just stand by and watch." Tarek nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "We'll hold them off as long as we can." The human ships began to move into position above the planet, each one lining up with military precision. Azara's eyes narrowed as she watched them, trying to calculate how long it would take for the human ships to reach the enemy. The Zalnar fleet, still many miles away, had not yet seen the humans for what they were. They would soon learn the truth. It didn't take long for the Zalnar forces to react. They had seen the human ships, and their movements grew erratic. Atsara could tell that they hadn't expected the humans to be here. They had assumed that humanity, like the others, would be too weak to fight. But now, the situation was different. "They're coming," Tarek said, his voice low but steady. "They'll be on us in minutes." Atsara nodded, the weight of the moments settling in her chest. It was up to them now to buy as much time as possible, as Alnar couldn't be allowed to reach the survivors. They had to fight, even with everything against them. Then, without warning, the human ships fired. A massive burst of energy shot from the lead ship, sending a shockwave through the air. The blast hit one of the Zalnar warships dead on, and it exploded in a fiery ball of destruction. The survivors watched in disbelief as the Zalnar ship disintegrated in the sky, leaving nothing but debris. Azara's breath caught in her throat. The humans weren't playing around. They were serious. Another volley of fire lit up the night, and a second Zalnar ship was struck, its shields failing instantly. It was a direct hit. 10 seconds, it was gone. The survivors stared in awe. The humans had come with far more than just hope. They had brought power. Enough power to change the course of this battle. Azara gripped her weapon tighter, knowing they needed to act fast. "Move, move," she shouted. "We need to take out their ground forces. The humans can handle the ships." The survivors quickly moved into position, their weapons raised as they aimed at the Zalnar forces. But even with the humans dealing with the ships, the ground battle was still fierce. The Zalnar troops were highly trained, and the survivors were vastly outnumbered, but the human firepower was enough to turn the tide. The Zalnar ground forces hesitated, seeing their fleet decimated in seconds. They had never seen anything like this. The survivors, bolstered by the humans' presence, began to push back, slowly but surely. Ozara's heart swelled with pride. She had been wrong about humanity. They weren't weak. They weren't just a small, insignificant species. They were strong. They were capable. And now, they were fighting alongside the survivors of Zora-9. As the human ships continued to fire, the ground forces began to retreat. The Zalnar were confused, unsure of what to do. They'd expected an easy victory. Instead, they were being outclassed by humans who had arrived just in time. Azara looked up at the sky, watching as the human ships circled above, covering them from the air. She felt a deep sense of gratitude. The humans had come through when no one else had. "Thank you," Azara whispered, her voice barely audible. "You saved us." As the last of the Zalnar ships were destroyed, the survivors watched in disbelief. The battle was over. The impossible had been achieved. Safe, and they had humanity to thank for it. The sky above Zora-9 was filled with flashes of light, as the human ships continued to rain fire on the retreating Zalnar forces. The once certain victory of the Zalnar seemed to be slipping away, and their once confident commanders were beginning to panic. As Hara watched in awe as the human warships fired again, their weapons lighting up the dark sky. With each blast, another Zalnar ship was destroyed, leaving behind only the debris of what was once a powerful force. It was clear now the humans had come to fight. They were more than capable. The survivors, who had once been prepared to make a final stand, now found themselves filled with hope. It wasn't just the humans' weapons that gave them this new sense of confidence. It was their determination, their unwillingness to back down, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The humans had proven that they were capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. Hera stood tall, her hand gripping her weapon tightly. She had been wrong to doubt humanity. They weren't the weak species she had heard about in galactic circles. No, these humans were warriors. They had come from a small, isolated planet. And yet they were showing the galaxy just what they were capable of. The Zalnar fleet, now, in chaos, tried to regroup, but the human ships had already set the stage for their defeat. The humans had studied their enemies. They understood the Zalnar's weaknesses. And now they were exploiting every one of them. "This is it," Azara said, turning to her team. "The Zalnar are broken. We need to finish them off." The survivors, now fully reinvigorated, began to push forward, taking advantage of the confusion. They moved through the wreckage of the enemy's forces, striking at the remaining Zalnar soldiers, who were too disorganized to mount a proper defense. The once terrifying enemy was now nothing more than a fleeing force, scrambling to get away. From the human ships above, Tarek, one of Ozara's most trusted soldiers, turned to her with a grin. Looks like we might just make it. Atsara allowed herself a small smile, but she didn't let herself relax just yet. Not yet. Keep moving. We still have to be sure they're gone.
Yes.
As they advanced, the survivors could hear the roar of human ships above them, cutting through the sky like thunder. The hum of engines and the sound of weapons fire filled the air, creating a sense of rhythm. For the first time in what felt like forever, the survivors felt like they were in control. The Zalnar had no chance of winning now. The human ships, though smaller than the massive Zalnar warships, proved their worth. They were nimble, able to dodge the Zalnar's slow-moving fire, and their weapons were precise and powerful. The Zalnar, with their overwhelming numbers, had been confident that they could easily crush the resistance on Zorathnine, but they had underestimated humanity's tactics, speed, and sheer will to fight. The battle was nearly over when a loud cheer broke out among the survivors. The Zalnar forces were retreating, leaving the battlefield in a mess of wreckage and smoke. The human ships had done the impossible. They had turned the tide, and the survivors had won. Azia Hera stood in the middle of the battlefield, staring up at the human ships as they circled overhead. The sky, once filled with the threat of Zalnar warships, now seemed peaceful. The human ships had provided a shield for the survivors, driving off the invaders with unmatched strength. It was a victory that none of them had dared hope for. She turned to her people, their faces filled with disbelief and relief. They had made it. They had survived. They owed it all to the humans who had answered their desperate call for help. "We did it," Atsara said, her voice full of wonder. "We're alive." The survivors, still catching their breath, looked up at the sky. The human ships were slowly making their way back toward the larger ship that had sent them. They had come, and they had fought. They had saved Zorathnine from total destruction. Tarek walked up to Atsara, his expression one of disbelief. "I never thought we'd make it. I never thought anyone would come." Atsara nodded, her eyes still scanning the sky. "I didn't either. But they did. The humans. They did what no one else would." As the survivors watched, the human ships began to descend, landing gracefully on the rocky surface of Zorathnine. The ships were not large, but they were impressive in their own right. Atsara could see the human crew disembarking, each of them moving with purpose, ready to assist with whatever was needed. Atsara and her team walked toward the landing site, where the human soldiers were already assembling. They were different from the Zalnar, with their light armor and simple weapons. But there was a strength in their movements, a determination that made it clear they were not to be underestimated. A human officer stepped forward to greet Atsara, his uniform simple but clearly military. "We're here to help," he said, his voice steady but kind. "What's your plan?" Atsara took a deep breath, her mind clearing for the first time in days. "We need to rebuild. The Zalnar have taken so much from us. But now we have a chance. With your help, we can start again." The human officer nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes." And just like that, the survivors of Zorathnine found new hope. They had fought hard, but they hadn't done it alone. Humanity had arrived just in time, and now, together, they would rebuild what had been lost. The Zalnar had underestimated humanity, and in doing so, they had given the survivors of Zorathnine a second chance. The survivors stood in a newly cleared area of the battlefield, their eyes focused on the human soldiers who had just landed. The sounds of distant explosions had faded, leaving only the hum of the human ships as they powered down. Azara's heart still raced, her mind spinning with disbelief at what had just happened. They had won, against all odds. Thanks to humanity, the human officer who had greeted them earlier, a tall man with short dark hair, stepped forward again. He gave Atsara a respectful nod before speaking. "We've cleared the area, but we'll need to move fast. The Zalnar might regroup soon. We'll help you fortify the perimeter." Atsara nodded, still trying to process the fact that help had arrived, and it had arrived just in time. The Zalnar had been closing in, their forces nearly overwhelming. But in the end, it was humanity that saved them. The humans had shown up, not with just weapons, but with a fierce determination to help a resolve that made all the difference. "We'll help," Atsara said, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Let's make sure they don't come back. Tarek, one of Azara's most trusted soldiers, joined her. The Zalner won't know what hit them, but we need to make sure we're ready for the next wave. He looked up at the human ships, the admiration clear in his voice. I still can't believe they came. I thought we were alone. Zara smiled. We were never truly alone. They were just waiting for the right moment to act. The human soldiers worked quickly, setting up defenses and helping the survivors rebuild what had been destroyed. They weren't just soldiers, they were engineers, medics, and strategists. The humans had everything the survivors needed to start again. Atsara had thought the humans would be too small, too outmatched. She had been wrong. The humans were resilient. They were capable of more than anyone had expected. As the hours passed, the survivors and humans began to work side by side, creating a fortified perimeter to protect against any future attacks. Atsara watched as the human officers spoke with her soldiers, exchanging ideas and strategies. There was a sense of unity between them now, a shared purpose. They were not just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for a future, for the chance to rebuild what had been lost. Later, that evening, as the sun set over Zorathnine, Azara stood outside the perimeter, gazing up at the human ships still hovering above. The world felt different now, quieter, as if the weight of the battle had lifted. Even if just for a moment. The human officer, the one who had greeted her, approached quietly and stood next to her. You know, he said, breaking the silence back. On Earth, people talk about Zorathnine. They talk about what happened here, how you fought, how your people resisted, even when things looked impossible. It was ... It was inspiring. Atsara looked at him, surprised. You heard of us? The officer nodded. We knew you were fighting a losing battle. But when we saw your message, we knew we had to act. It wasn't just about saving your people. It was about showing the galaxy that no one is truly alone, that sometimes you just need to fight to be heard. Atsara felt a lump in her throat. She had never thought of their struggle as something that could inspire others. She had thought they were just fighting for survival. But now, with the humans beside them, everything had changed. We never thought anyone would answer, Atsara said softly. We thought we were doomed. The officer smiled. You're not the first to think that, but humanity, you don't give up easily. You may have been alone before, but you're not anymore. We're here now, and we'll stay as long as you need us. Atsara looked back at the survivors, now working with the humans, building something new. There was hope in the air. For the first time, she believed that their fight had meaning. They weren't just defending a dying planet anymore. They were defending a future that had been made possible by humanity's unexpected arrival. The next day, the survivors, with the help of the human soldiers, began to clear the wreckage of their former cities. It was hard work, but there was a sense of purpose in every movement. They were rebuilding, not just their homes, but their way of life. The planet would not be the same as it once was, but it didn't have to be. With humanity's help, it could be something even better. Atsara stood in the middle of the clearing, looking around at the efforts of everyone working together. The once barren land was beginning to show signs of life again. It wasn't much yet, but it was enough. It was a start. She turned to the human officer who was overseeing the work. Thank you, she said simply, her voice full of gratitude. The officer nodded. We did what we had to do. It's the least we could do. Atsara knew he was right. The humans had done more than just answer a call for help. They had given the survivors a second chance, a chance to live, to rebuild, and to thrive once again. The Zalnar had underestimated humanity, and in doing so, they had paved the way for the survivors to rise from the ashes. As the day went on, the work continued, and Azara's heart swelled with pride. She looked around at her people, the humans, and the planet they were rebuilding together. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt full of possibility. Humanity had come through when no one else would. And for that, Zorathnine would never forget. The work on Zorathnine had begun, and every day felt like a new beginning. Atsara stood at the edge of the newly cleared area, looking out at the vast landscape that had once seemed so bleak. Now, there was a sense of renewal in the air. The survivors had begun to rebuild their homes, their cities, and their lives. With the help of the human soldiers who had brought more than just weapons, they had brought hope. The human ships had left their mark on the planet, not just in the destruction of the Zalnar forces, but in the way they had helped the survivors regain their strength. It wasn't just about saving a planet. It was about giving a people the chance to rebuild what they had lost, to start fresh.
Ow!
And the humans had done that, as the survivors and humans worked together. Atsara couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. When the first call for help had been sent, she had felt a deep sense of hopelessness. The Zalnar forces had been unstoppable, and no one seemed to care about Zorathnine. They were a forgotten people, abandoned to face their doom alone. But humanity had changed that. "Hey, Atsara." Tarek's voice brought her back to the present. She turned to see him walking toward her, a smile on his face. "Yeah, everything's looking good. The perimeter is secure, and the defenses are holding strong." Atsara nodded, but her mind was still full of questions. "It's hard to believe we're really here, that we made it." Tarek chuckled. "Yeah, it doesn't feel real, does it? But here we are. We're alive. We've got a second chance." Atsara turned back to look at the survivors working alongside the human soldiers. They were building something new. It wasn't just the physical work, it was the feeling of being part of something larger than themselves, of having a purpose. Again, the fear and desperation that had once clouded their minds had been replaced with a renewed sense of determination. "You know," Tara continued, "I don't think we ever would have made it without them. The humans, we wouldn't have stood a chance against the Zalnor." Atsara smiled. "You're right. I never imagined they would be the ones to save us." Tarek shrugged. "I guess sometimes the universe works in strange ways." "Glad it did." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, watching as humans and survivors worked side by side. The human soldiers had been teaching the survivors new techniques for defense and rebuilding, and many of the human engineers had begun to design new structures to replace the ones that had been destroyed. There was a sense of community now, of unity between the two species. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As the day wore on, Atsara found herself walking toward the small outpost where the human officer who had led the mission was stationed. His name was Captain Ellis, and he had been the one to first send the message that had saved them all. She had seen him a few times since their arrival, but she hadn't had the chance to speak with him in more than passing. When she arrived at the outpost, she found him sitting at a table, reviewing some maps and data. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with a warm smile. "Atsara, good to see you," he said, standing to greet her. "Good to see you too, Captain," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "I wanted to thank you again for everything. We wouldn't have made it without your help." Captain Ellis waved her thanks away. "It was our pleasure. We couldn't leave you to fight alone. You're not just survivors, you're warriors. You fought for your planet, for your people. We were just here to give you the help you needed to finish what you started." Atsara looked at him, grateful for his words. "I never thought I'd see the day when humanity would be the one to save us. I always thought you were. It's just a small, primitive species. I didn't think you had the strength to fight on our level." Ellis chuckled. "We're small, sure, but we've got a lot of heart. And when we're pushed to our limit, we don't back down. I guess that's what sets us apart." Atsara smiled, feeling a deep sense of respect for the humans who had shown up when no one else would. They had faced overwhelming odds, and yet they had not hesitated to do what was necessary. They had saved Zorathnine, but more than that, they had shown the galaxy that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. "You've shown us what true strength is," Atsara said, her voice filled with admiration. "I used to think strength was just about power, about having the biggest weapons or the largest fleets. But now I see it's about determination. It's about fighting for something greater than yourself." Ellis nodded. "That's the human way. We don't give up, no matter the odds. We fight for the future, for what's worth protecting. And right now, that's what we're doing here for Zorathnine, for your people." Sora's eyes softened. "You've given us more than just a chance to rebuild. You've given us hope again." I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that. You don't have to, Ellis replied. We're all in this together now, and that's what matters. As the sun set on Zerothnine, Etzara looked out over the planet that had once seemed so doomed. It was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of the future lifting. The Zalnar were gone, and they were no longer alone. Humanity had come through when they were needed most, and now, together, they would face whatever challenges came next. The planet of Zorathnine was not lost. It was reborn. And it was all thanks to the unexpected allies who had shown up just in time.